vampire who hates immortality. Seeing her never mature body, she chose to burn herself into ash under the sun. In an epidemic hundreds of years later, vampires had dominated the world, and humans were raised like pigs underground. In this world, everything was turned upside down. Dawn was the busiest moment. This is an old beggar who is begging for blood, but no one cares about him, and they leave coldly. Children turned into vampires and couldn't grow up anymore, and the immortal elderly were everywhere. In front of the grocery store, many people were waiting in line to buy blood. Recently, the price of blood was increasingly expensive. This man without a reflection in the mirror was Edward, a blood specialist. That day, he was urgently summoned to the headquarters. His boss said that after 10 years, most humans had died. Now the number of people still alive was less than 5%. This made the world of vampires went into crisis. The bloodthirsty vampires began to attack their fellow. After sucking the blood of their race, they would turn into monsters. The boss told Edward that they had to find a solution quickly. Now they had two options. One was research on how to make human blood, two was human blood immunity. This is the result of the second option. It was obviously a failure. After being immune to human blood, vampires would degenerate and die quickly, no matter how many additional fluids were injected. So they could only turn their hope into making human blood. We must commence testing the blood substitute. Edward carefully injected the testing substitute. Edward's boss nervously observed the reaction of the person being tested. How do you feel? No change, sir. Everything seemed to be going well. I feel fine, sir. Unfortunately, the problem still happened. Edward tried to give emergency help, but he was still explored on the spot. The army was desperate. So was Edward. He was terrified, then went home with a heavy heart. He watched the introduction on TV. Edward suddenly felt tired. He didn't want to be a vampire anymore. Edward turned around. It was his younger brother. His younger brother brought the 35th birthday present to him. That was Edward's 10th 35-year-old birthday. The gift was a bottle of human fresh blood. But Edward didn't want to drink it, so he threw it away. This made his brother very angry. The back door wasn't locked, so the monster came in, scaring Edward to death. Luckily, Edward's brother was a soldier, so he quickly took down the monster. The police arrived and cleaned up the scene. On the monster's body, they discovered a wedding ring. It turned out that this monster was Edward's acquaintance. Before turning into a monster, he was Edward's employee. He turned out like that because he didn't have money to buy blood. This deeply hurt Edward. He's a vampire who still had a human conscience. It's getting morning soon. Edward started to fall asleep. The next evening, he went back to the human blood substitute research lab. But just one sentence from his supervisor made him lose all faith. I'd just like your guarantee that a substitute would replace our need for a human supply. We must allow the human race time to repopulate. The majority of the population will be content with a blood substitute. But there will always be those who are willing to pay a little extra for the real thing. That cup of coffee was made from human blood. When stirred up, there was fresh blood inside. Edward didn't like this experience at all. Not a coffee drinker, not really. Because he didn't want to be a vampire anymore. He didn't want to suck blood, even didn't want to kill anyone. He was a rare vegetarian in the vampire world. As a person with high status, he was about to suffer a crisis that vampires did. Just relying on human blood was not going to be enough. In an accident, he saved a group of people. There was a beautiful girl, her name was Audrey. She told Edward there was a way for him to stop sucking blood. It's back to being human again. She took Edward to a 100-year-old tree where Edward met a man. He was once a vampire but now was a human. That person told Edward that if he let the sun burn him moderately, he would be able to feel his heartbeat again. Feel that? Hadn't been beating for 9 years. It is impossible. Edward wavered. It's not just for himself. He felt that being back to humans was the only way for his kind to continue to exist. So he followed those two to the headquarters of the human race. There, they find a wine fermentation tank could be opened and closed. It seemed that Edward could return to being human using this tank. They acted immediately. They renovated the tank. Everything was in place. The transformation could be started. Audrey put Edward in the renovated tank. But at that moment, the soldier looking for Edward had also arrived. The first experimental researcher was indeed very different. Edward found himself about to be arrested, so he made up his mind and immediately began to transform. He opened the switch. Edward was set on fire. Then opened, burnt, opened again, burnt again. Edward finally had his heartbeat once again. He was back to being a human. The soldiers had also arrived. Those who had transformed immediately hid into another tank. They managed to escape the soldiers, but Edward's brother still discovered them. Edward's brother had been hungry for several days, so he couldn't help but bite the other man who turned into a human. Unexpectedly, something strange happened. After twitching, he became human. It turned out that blood of the vampire after turning back into a human had the effect of serum. This helped Edward came up with a plan. He knew how to save this world full of pressure, devastating and about to collapse. The world of vampires began to face a crisis. The human who could draw blood was less and less. More and more vampires became insane. All vampires were starving. Seeing the city was going to be in chaos, some vampires who had status and money even started wanting to rob. This is not what I asked for. We're now only permitted to serve 5% blood with every coffee. Just put some more fucking blood in my coffee. This is the daughter of the tycoon in the vampire world, but she was a normal human. She refused to be an evil vampire like her dad, so she wounded her father, then locked herself into a dark room. Why is it evil? That's because vampires were just some creatures whose existence depends on sucking blood, but thought of themselves as noble, completely ignored the fact that humanity was about to die out due to their employment. After the extinction of mankind, the vampire class in fact also couldn't survive. Even so, the tycoon still wanted his daughter to become a vampire. He thought that it was the best for his daughter. It was honorable to be a vampire. Unfortunately, his daughter didn't think so. After being turned into a vampire, the girl refused to drink blood and started to bite herself instead. Vampires, after sucking the blood of their kind, would become monsters. So she turned into a monster. There were still many vampires that had turned into monsters. Because of the desperation, there were more and more vampires starting sucking their blood, so there were more and more monsters. Then, the military took action. They decided to burn to death the vampires turned into monsters, including the daughter of the tycoon. The one who took her away was the male lead's brother. He felt a little guilty, but as a soldier, he couldn't go against the order. So he could only watch the girl being burned to death. A group of monsters was burned, but there was still another group behind. All were live on television. Unfortunately, these rituals couldn't prevent the blood shortage crisis. Our families are starving. Luckily at that moment, the male lead Edward returned. He had been back into a human and returned to his old office. He told his former boss that he had found a way to solve the crisis. That was to make the vampires who want to suck blood give up their immortal and turn back to human. So the generation would continue to be passed down. That was impossible. The tycoon didn't even listen. He was in the top position of the world. He would never accept to become human again. Therefore, Edward could only provoke the tycoon, let him bite him, use his blood to force the tycoon to turn back into a human. After being back to human, the tycoon was tied on a chair and sat there waiting for the bloodthirsty soldiers to arrive. Those soldiers tore the tycoon apart and became human thanks to his blood. Troops after troops. Soldiers tore each other apart and became human, then being bitten by the next troop of bloodthirsty vampires. After a chaotic battle, the vampires' return to being human was spread wider and wider. They couldn't suck each other's blood anymore, so the crisis could be stopped. The sun rose again. The end.